Epilogue to the Ark of the Covenant. So many people mentioned to me about the work of Graham Hancock regarding the Ark of the Covenant.
This incredibly mysterious, powerful, energized biblical relic. And we understand that it had these two winged figures which were perched on top of a lid that was called the mercy seat. And the two winged figures are described as cherubim, and their wings join together above the ark. And it's often spoken of a cloud and a light and a fire that rises up between these two figures. It's impossible to read the very detailed biblical and extra-biblical accounts of the Ark of the Covenant without, at some point or another, thinking technology.
So if you're coming to this channel anew, you probably want to go and check out all the things I've said already about the Ark of the Covenant. So let's get back to what Graham Hancock has to say on the subject.
And it's clear to anybody who has studied the Ark and also studied ancient Egyptian traditions that there are commonalities.
So what are some of the things that the Ark is described as being capable of? Well, the first and most obvious one is it provides the ability to talk to God.
Because Moses did talk to God through the Ark of the Covenant.
So I think it's fairly safe to say that Moses was talking to someone using the Ark of the Covenant. Does this sound like technology? I think so.
Just a quick summary of some of the things that the Ark does. It stops the waters of the River Jordan when the Israelites cross into Jordan. It's rather like a repeat of the Red Sea.
I mentioned in my earlier episodes, they did the trick with the water twice, whereby they pushed the water aside so that they could go through an area which would otherwise have drowned them. So that technology, that vibrational frequency technology, which kept the water away, was used on 2 occasions.
Again, sounds like technology to me.
Graham also discusses it as a weapon, but here is where we disagree.
Carrying the Ark, it's a fearsome weapon in battle. It's used again and again in battle, and there are accounts of the Ark flying forward, rushing forward towards the enemies of Israel, emitting a moaning or a howling sound, and sparks of fire shooting out of it.
I only disagree in the context of it being a battlefield weapon. I think it's a bit more subtle than that. Because its first venture onto the battlefield, it basically did nothing. And the Philistines won, and they took the Ark with them. And, well, they didn't have a very pleasant time because of that. But you'll have to check out my other episodes for the details. And I think that it was from what it did after that to the Philistines that its reputation preceded it, and it was then a lot more useful in battle. Let Graham Hancock explain what the Philistines actually did with the Ark of the Covenant.
Ashdod, it becomes a sort of tourist trophy, and the population of Ashdod file past it. And then we read in the Bible how they all die very soon afterwards, and there's a specific statement that they die of cancerous tumors. So all of this, you can't read this without wondering what on earth is going on.
From that alone, we know it was dangerous. But there's so much more.
It kills the unfortunate Uzzah when it's being carried up towards Jerusalem. It's being carried on a cart, and he reaches out to steady it, and a bolt of fire shoots out of it and kills him on the spot.
Well, I explain the technology around this in more detail in my episodes, but
it's implicated in the destruction of Jericho. We tend to focus on the blowing of the horns, but it's the ark that's carried 7 times around the walls of Jericho, and the walls of Jericho come down. It's difficult to resist a feeling that we're dealing with some sort of out-of-place technology here.
Precisely what I've been saying. So Yeah, I can completely explain how Atlantean technology could be used in this way. Now let's talk about King Solomon and his role in this bigger picture.
It's Solomon who gets to build the temple that will contain the ark. Solomon, who is renowned actually for his magical powers and for his wisdom. So the ark, Solomon builds the temple, and the ark is now carried in great ceremony into the temple. And we read how a cloud fills the space of the Holy of Holies. And that's when the ark disappears from view. After that, it's hardly mentioned in the Bible again.
As soon as I started looking at Solomon, I realized I'm going down a rabbit hole.
This thing sounds like a piece of technology. It's constructed, it's carefully made. There's a blueprint, there's instructions on what to do. There's gold, there's wood, there's gold.
Yes.
There's these mysterious tablets that are placed inside it, whatever they are. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there might be a forgotten technological episode in the past of humanity. And I would not have gone on to write my books about the possibility of a lost civilization if I had not first had that encounter with the mystery of the Ark of the Covenant.
So he clearly thinks that it is technology, which of course, for those of you who have been listening to my channel, you will know that that is exactly what I've been saying.
And it came to my attention that the Ethiopians claim to possess this object. Well, obviously I was interested.
Okay.
This fascinating, powerful, mysterious object, and it's hidden in the mountains of Ethiopia. I had never heard that before, so I began to investigate that particular claim.
So this is where Graham Hancock thinks the Ark of the Covenant actually went.
And why should Ethiopia be connected to the story of the Ark of the Covenant? Well, the possibility that it was connected to the story of the Ark of the Covenant rather forced itself upon me during the very early 1980s. In fact, in 1982-83, I was the East African correspondent for The Economist. I was travelling regularly in Ethiopia.
So Graham Hancock's been into this subject of the Ark of the Covenant since the 1980s and is clearly an expert on the subject. So it's no wonder people kept telling me, you've got to go and check out his work on the Ark of the Covenant after I did my episode on the Ark. And that was good advice, that's for sure.
There was something going on here, because although archaeologists were rejecting Ethiopia's claim, they're saying there was nothing to it, it was a complete fantasy.
Okay.
My own eyes showed me that it was central to Ethiopian culture. They had a rich history that told how they had come to Ethiopia and how they had brought the Ark of the Covenant with them. It's a different story from the story that the Ethiopian national epic tells. The Ethiopian national epic is called the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of Kings.
So, of course, I decided I had to investigate the Kebra Nagast. And wow, is that worth reading? That's where I got a few of these surprises. And I'll come back to that subject shortly.
Personally, I think the Ethiopian claim is rather strong.
Now that I've read the Kebra Nagast, I don't think that the story told within the Kebra Nagast is actually too different to the other Ethiopian story about the journey of the Ark of the Covenant. I think that they could just be different perspectives. In one story, the Ark resided in several locations at different times, whereas in the Kebra Nagast, it's unclear as to where in Ethiopia the Ark of the Covenant actually ended up. There is even a suggestion that the Ark of the Covenant spent a little time in Egypt on Elephantine Island. The Kebra Nagast tells some very interesting stories about what happened in Egypt. I will now read a little section directly from the Kebra Nagast. and they were blowing flutes, and they travelled on wagons, like the host of the heavenly beings. And those who were in the cities and towns were witnesses that when these men came into the land of Egypt, our gods and the gods of the king fell down and were dashed into pieces, and the towers of the idols were likewise broken into fragments. So this is reminiscent of what happened to the Philistines and the statue of their god Dagon, as well as what happened to the walls of Jericho. So it is clear that when the Ethiopians were taking the Ark of the Covenant through Egypt, they permitted the Ark to do quite a lot of damage. And it's unclear whether this was intentional or they did not know how to control it. It would seem that the Egyptians didn't do anything about it since they were only passing through, and also because they must have felt quite scared of the whole thing. And the reputation of what had happened in the past with the Philistines had probably reached them also. Now, coming back to the Philistines, yes, reading that in the Kebra-Nagast, here's what it says. This is about the Philistines. This is page 79. What gift ought we to give her, and how shall we send her back? And they're talking about returning the Ark of the Covenant to the Israelites because it had caused such devastation in their lands. And the priests of the Philistines took counsel together again, and they said unto their king and unto their governors, Make for her, according to the heads of your houses, 60 images of mice in gold, since mice have destroyed our land, and 60 images of the member of a man, since your own persons have suffered from sores and boils on your members. Oh, this is a bit of a can of worms, and I assure you that pun was absolutely intended. But, joking aside, that meant that the Ark of the Covenant was actually full of small golden mice and small golden dildos, for lack of a better word. It boggles the mind. It really does. It does explain why there were mice embroidered into the cover they used on the Ark of the Covenant. It was mentioned somewhere that I read that the cover, when it was in the Temple of Solomon, it had beautiful little mice embroidered into the cover in gold. So, well, it does explain another thing. The pieces of the jigsaw puzzle are fitting together slowly. How the Ark of the Covenant came to be in Ethiopia.
The Ethiopian national epic is called the Kebra-Nagast, the Glory of Kings. And in that they claim that the Queen of Sheba was an Ethiopian queen. She made her famous biblical visit to the court of Solomon. She was made pregnant by Solomon, according to the Ethiopian version. She returned to Ethiopia. She bore the child. His name was Menelik, means the son of the wise man. And the story is that at the age of about 20 or 21, he went back to Jerusalem. He was recognized by his father. And somehow, after 1 year in the court of Solomon, he contrived to steal the Ark of the Covenant. This is written in the Kebra-Nagast, and carried it off to Ethiopia.
This is what it says in the Kebra-Nagast about the time when Menelik takes the Ark of the Covenant and possibly a few other things as well from his father, King Solomon. And Michael the archangel marched in front and spread out his wings and made them march through the sea as if upon dry land. And upon the dry land he cut a path for them and spread himself out like a cloud over them when he hid them from the fiery heat of the sun. And no man hauled his wagons, but whether it was men, horses, mules, or loaded camels, He was raised above the ground to the height of a cubit, and all those who rose upon beasts were lifted up, along with the beasts, to the height of one span of a man, and everyone travelled in the wagons. So there's a lot to unpack in that sentence from the Kebra Nagast. First of all, there's the Archangel Michael at the front leading the way, and then there are these floating platform wagon things that everybody and every animal is upon, and they're travelling 1 cubit above the ground the whole way, floating through the air, but not just floating slowly. It says in other passages that they were actually going along quite fast. So it's quite an interesting concept that they had not only the magic carpets, but they also had some supernatural being, I say that with quotes around it, leading the way, because to me that sounds like someone from the ancients coming along to give these guys a hand to get everything to Ethiopia in as quick a time as possible. So here's my thoughts based on the dreams that I've had. So there was this one guy called Japet. He was the last ruler of Atlantis, what I call Tantal. And he took an unhealthy interest in the more primitive peoples, and he liked to, let's say, manipulate them and control them and interfere in their lives. It was something that made him feel like the big I am, and it is also something that aggravated the other people from Tantal, who had a policy of non-interference. And, well, if they did interfere, it was only to help. And so what Japet used to do to aggravate the others was persuade them that sacrificing animals was a good idea and things like that, which really did aggravate the others rather a lot. But anyway, this character, he would take groups of human groups, and he would help them. And if they didn't do what he wanted, he would punish them. And it was a rather unpleasant way of carrying on. But it looks to me like he or one of his people decided to help out the crowd that were leaving Israel and give them a nice helping hand to get out of there and take with them, i.e. steal, as much as they could. We don't know if these platforms that they were floating above the ground on came from the being they called Michael, who I think is one of Japet's people, or if it was one of the items stolen, or multiple items stolen from King Solomon. Considering it was a large group of people that were on the move, and there were therefore a lot of platforms to take the items they were carrying, plus all the animals, plus the people, then I cannot imagine that was something stolen from King Solomon. I think that the platforms must have been brought to the area for that purpose by Michael. I've done lots of episodes on my channel covering the levitation technology, and this sort of thing is perfectly normal from my dreams. So these items are vibrational technology, and you can read about those, you can hear about those on my other episodes. And these platforms, they would have just stepped onto them, and then the person in the front, Michael, would have controlled their rise, and they would have just moved on. So it's easy to imagine how the concept of a flying carpet came about. So to me, this is all technology that I have seen and even used myself in my dream regressions. So there's nothing new in any of this from my perspective. There's only one thing that I found a bit disturbing, and that was the fact that they had left the Ark of the Covenant essentially switched on. And so when they went through Egypt, there was a lot of damage of the statues and the buildings in the area that they passed through. And this is a bit disturbing because they clearly had the ability to switch it off, and they had Michael with them anyway, who was in the know. And if it was on the whole time, how come they weren't being damaged themselves, the people travelling with it? So that's the only thing that makes me go, something's fishy about this part of the story. So we'll move on to Ethiopia now. We know that it eventually made it to Axum. Now, we don't know if it spent time in other parts of Ethiopia or even other parts of Egypt along the way. It's not 100% clear, but it did make its way, according to the Kepler Nagast, to Ethiopia, and according to other sources, including Graham Hancock, who I'll be playing a clip shortly, it resided in a little chapel in Axum.
One of those processions. There is the oldest church in Africa. That's the Church of St. Mary of Zion, which stands on top of an even older Christian structure going back to the 3rd century AD. And beside it is this little chapel, which was built by the Emperor Haile Selassie, whose original name was Ras Tafari, means Prince Tafari. Of course, the Rastafarians named themselves after him. He built this chapel for the Ark of the Covenant, and in the 1960s it was taken out of the Church of St. Mary of Zion and carried into this chapel, and there it's remained ever since.
So, is there any evidence that the Ark actually does reside in this chapel? Well, I guess the main part is the guardian of the chapel.
Once you're appointed as guardian of the Ark, you have a very short lifespan. We found about 3 years. Then the guardians die. We've got, in our series of visits to Axum over a period of several years, we met a number of different guardians whose predecessors had all died. We knew their predecessor, he died, a new guy had taken over.
This artifact is so dangerous that no one is ever allowed into that chapel. No one ever gets to see it except the guardian. And that person essentially gives up the rest of their life to look after the Ark. And they're the only person who actually gets to ever see it. And they don't talk about it. They're not allowed to.
Okay, so no, I was never allowed into the temple to see the Ark of the Covenant. And I don't know of anybody who ever has been allowed in to see it.
So they talk about having the Ark of the Covenant, but they don't talk about anything else that may have been taken from the Temple of Solomon. And yet, there are some impressive stone structures. So when I look at these structures, I once again think of Atlantean technology, and I wonder, did they steal something else from the king that isn't written about? Something like the shamir of King Solomon. So let's just talk about that now. Better still, let's let Graham Hancock and Mauro Biglino explain what the shamir is.
I'm recollecting a thing called the shamir, sometimes described as a worm.
Oh yes, there is also the shamir.
Sounds also technological. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. The shamir is an object very difficult to explain because is quoted only one or two times in the Bible.
For some reason, they weren't allowed to use chisels or iron tools when they were building the Temple of Solomon on site. In 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 7, it says, "In building the temple, only blocks dressed at the quarry were used, and no hammer, chisel, or any other iron tool was heard at the temple site while it was being built." And in the Talmud, it goes even further to state that King Solomon had to get his hands on something called the shamir in order to build the temple. And yes, there's a few stories around how he got his hands on the shamir, but essentially this was quite an impressive tool for cutting stone. Talmud is even very clear on how it operates. So it says, one writes the letters on them, i.e. the stones, in ink and shows them, i.e. he places a shamir close to the ink markings from outside without having it touch the stones, and they split open along the lines of the ink of their own accord, like this fig that splits in the summer without losing anything of its mass, and like this field in a valley that cracks in the rainy season without losing anything of its mass. The shamir was used in this way for these engravings. So what this statement from the Talmud is telling us is that there were no byproducts. There was no dust. Nothing was lost in this process. And this shamir was an amazing tool that had the ability to do this engraving. Talmud goes on to say, this shamir, its size is that of a barley corn, and it was created in the 6 days of creation, and nothing hard can withstand it. In what is it kept, so that it will not break everything in the vicinity? They wrap it in tufts of wool and place it in a leaden vessel full of barley bran, which is soft and will not be broken by the shamir. Very clearly an item of technology, and it is also tuned for stone, for rock, and it is an item that I have already provided a description for in some of my previous episodes. It's the one I was working with looked a little bit different to what's described here, but it essentially worked exactly the same way. And to give you an idea of how many other places you see a representation of this device, you just have to look at the Vatican or the ancient Mesopotamian carvings, because they all have that same look. This shape of device was used for many, many things in Atlantis, and it is even the same shape as the head of the ankh, because the ankh was part of the longevity technology. And so you see it everywhere. It's hard not to see it once you've seen it. Here's just a few photos that I've taken on my travels of things that look like a corn on the cob, and they are prolific in Egypt as well as in other areas. But since I was in Egypt last year, I got lots of nice photos of these shapes. Okay, so what am I actually saying about these devices? Well, not only did the ancient peoples see these devices, some of them may even have had some of these devices. And I think these devices were used in Ethiopia on these monolithic buildings. Why ever would they attempt to cut into massive pieces of stone, into the ground, through stone, to create a building out of a single piece of rock? It's it boggles the mind, seriously. It's not something that people would do unless they could do it relatively easily. And that's why I think they had one of these Shamias. So these pictures are images from Wikimedia Commons, and they show an image of what people think the Shamia would look like. And yeah, they've got the right shape, but the end that does all the work is the other end, not the end that they think does all the work. I had never even heard of the Shamia until it was pointed out to me by a fellow YouTuber. And then, of course, it came out on the interview that Graham Hancock did. So it is something that I feel as if I'm being pointed in that direction. And so when I did look at it, yeah, it is definitely the same as the things that I have seen in my dream regressions. So on that note, I'm just going to say goodbye to everyone and catch you in the next episode. Okay, bye. The audio clips of Graham Hancock are from a tour he did in 2014 when he took a group of people to India. And the more recent video clips that you will see are part of an interview that he did with Moro Beglingo. I don't know if I've said that right, but he's been discussing with Moro the concepts around the things written in the Bible.